Hello and welcome to this history podcast. Now, last podcast we were focusing on David Lloyd George, and I ended on a quote that you can see at the top here, which was from David Lloyd George after the Paris Peace Conference in Versailles. And his quote was that when asked how he thought he'd done, he said, "Not badly, considered I was seated between Jesus Christ and Napoleon." Now, we've already looked at the person David Lloyd George refers to as Napoleon, that was Georges Clemenceau, but this podcast we're going to just focus on Jesus Christ. And the reason I've highlighted this quote straight away is because the idea of Wilson before he became to the Paris Peace Conference is that he was somewhat of a saviour of Europe. A lot of people in Europe at the time felt he had come to save the day, and to an extent he had, because United States involvement in World War One had kind of won the war for the Allies, and so he was seen as a saviour of Europe. And so what he had to offer after the war was over was even better, because America was the strongest country left at the end of World War One. And so a lot of people saw that he was going to bring peace and save Europe for years to come. Now, what does Wilson actually look like? So Woodrow Wilson is the man circled in red here. And he's always portrayed in cartoons as taller than the other big three, and he has glasses. So going to this picture down here, he has glasses and a head of hair. So the best way to remember him is the guy with the glasses. He's quite tall and has a head of hair, and he's quite thin. One way to remember him perhaps is as like a lanky Harry Potter, as someone once mentioned to me once about him. So today we're going to just look at his aims and his motives at the Paris Peace Conference. So as we said, Wilson was the President of America, and before he became to the Paris Peace Conference, and even before the war had ended, one of his main motives in dealing with Germany and what to do with Europe was the fact that he absolutely detested any kind of war. And he'd kind of been reluctantly dragged into the First World War, and in a way I suppose resented the fact that America had to save the day. In the end they got dragged in because Germans were bombing American civilians on passenger ships, and so he wanted to make sure that war wasn't going to happen again, as obviously a lot of American lives had been lost on the front. But he also didn't want America to have to get dragged into another war. He believed in peace, not just for America and Europe, but for the whole world. He wanted everyone to be peaceful with each other. So like I said, another war wouldn't happen again, and one where America may have to get dragged in and involved in. Another motive of Wilson is that he absolutely despised the idea of empires. America didn't have an empire. It was a republic. It had 50 states, and that was it. And at the Paris Peace Conference, obviously, two of the other countries, France and Britain, had huge empires at the time. And that idea of empires, was counterintuitive to the American belief system. They didn't believe in having empires. They didn't believe in the idea of one country 1,000 miles away could have a say in another country. So when he was coming to the Paris Peace Conference, he had in his head, one of his motives was to get rid of empires and bring an end to that idea of colonisation. So because of that, he believed that every country should have the right to self-determination. So self-determination is that every country has the right to choose their own path, their own destiny, to have their own say in their politics. So completely against the idea of empires. So those were his motives as he came to the Paris Peace Conference. And just to draw your attention to this picture here, when he arrived in Paris, this was the reception that Wilson was given by the people of France. He was greeted with hundreds of thousands of cheers and waving people. So when he came to Paris, this idea of him being the saviour was really drummed home to the people, that he was going to bring peace and prosperity to Europe. And to an extent, I suppose, he kind of did believe it himself and started to believe that he was the saviour. And so he would bring an end to empires, and he would bring peace to the world, and that he would give everyone a say in their own independent way. Now, therefore, his aims was to make the world safe, and make sure that the only way he could make the world safe was to make sure that there was a fair peace. He didn't want to completely destroy Germany like Clemenceau did, or even make them pay as much as David Lloyd George did. America had the view that the First World War was everybody's fault in Europe. Yes, Germany had paid its part, but so did many other countries. Therefore, before the war had even ended, he'd put together his 14 points. And the 14 points listed exactly what he wanted from the Paris Peace Conference. Now, I'm not going to go through each of the 14 points, but the few main key points were that he wanted disarmament, which was where every country would get rid of its arms, armies, navies, tanks, bombs, weapons, make sure that everybody was on a level pegging. He also wanted to make sure there was a League of Nations. A League of Nations where countries could talk out their problems without going to war. So, like I said, this motive he didn't like the fact that America had had to been drawn into this European war, which, as we know, was the bloodiest, worst war of all time. So he felt that by creating a League of Nations, it would avoid this conflict ever happening again. And like I've mentioned already, one of his other aims was self-determination, especially for the peoples of Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe was in chaos, and had been in chaos for many decades before the war had even started. And one of his 14 points was listing specific countries that were going to get independence, like Poland and Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia and Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all these countries that after the peace conference do pop up, and therefore wanted to give those countries, those people who lived there, their own right, their self-determination to do what they wanted, to pick what they wanted. So, just to recap, if we look at this quote here, this is Woodrow Wilson speaking to Congress on the 8th of January 1918, so this is even before the war has ended in Europe. What we demand in this war is nothing peculiar to ourselves. It is that the world be made fit and safe to live in, and particularly that it be made safe for every peace-loving nation, which, like our own, wishes to live its own life, determine its own institutions, be assured of justice and fair dealing by the other peoples of the world, as against force and selfish aggression. So therefore you can see already in his speeches, he's talking about peace between nations, keeping the world fit and safe to live in. He wanted justice and fairness, and making sure that people can determine its own institutions. And yes, David Lloyd George and George Clemenceau would agree with this idea of peace in Europe. Who wouldn't? But obviously the way that Wilson was talking about it was, in a sense, a very idealistic way. And we'll see, really, that's why David Lloyd George, in the quote at the top here, which I'm going to circle again in blue, refers to Woodrow Wilson as Jesus Christ. And perhaps Wilson himself started to believe he was a somewhat Christ-like figure who was going to save the whole of the world. But don't forget that he didn't want to make sure that he wanted to make sure that America didn't get dragged into another war again. And so the only way was to create this fairness so that war would not happen again. So there's Wilson's aims and motives. He wanted to bring peace. He wanted to introduce his 14 points, which outlined disarmament and a League of Nations and self-determination for the people of Europe. But in a sense, was he going to be able to do this? Especially as we've already seen, we've got David Lloyd George and Clemenceau with completely different aims at what they wanted from the Paris Peace Conference. So next podcast, we're going to see what they did actually get out of the Treaty of Versailles, and were their aims and motives successful.